He was hailed as a hero in Britain, but in the American ranks, his name often drew a groan. To the press, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was the mastermind of El Alamein, the man who beat Rommel in the desert. But to many American generals, he was something else entirely, a self-promoting egotist who treated them like subordinates rather than allies. They fought on the same side, yet they could barely stand to be in the same room. Patton called him insufferable. Eisenhower bit his tongue through clenched teeth. Even ordinary GIs joked that Monty could win a war only if someone else did the fighting. How did one of Britain's greatest commanders become the most disliked man in the Allied High Command? This is the story of why the Americans hated Bernard Montgomery so much. They called him Monty, but to many Americans in the Allied High Command, he was something more, a rival, a showman, a strategist whose worship of caution and prestige clashed with the American spirit of boldness and speed. Imagine arriving in England in early 1944, fresh from training, full of optimism for D-Day, only to be introduced not just to your British allies, but to a man who demanded deference, who scrutinized your every move, and who seemed to carry an invisible tension whenever he walked through your briefing room. For many U.S. officers, Montgomery was not just another general, they felt he was watching them, judging them, competing with them. From the very moment his silhouette appeared in Normandy, he carried with him a grudge, or at least, a sense that his mission was to lead, to dominate, and never to defer. Americans who had once admired the British victories in North Africa later found their admiration strained by a personality that seemed to demand more credit than was due. Behind the cordial cups of tea and the handshake pictures, battles were fought not just on fields but in meeting rooms, in cables, and in memos. The question haunted many: was Montgomery a brilliant tactician with flaws, or a careerist whose ambition undercut Allied unity? The seeds of American dislike did not sprout overnight. They grew from years of misunderstandings, contrasting command cultures, and personalities that clashed not just over strategy but respect. The Americans prized speed, audacity, flexibility. Montgomery prized methodical preparation, control, and a conviction that fewer casualties, even if it meant slower progress, were the mark of a true general. Every bridge he delayed to consolidate, every hill he refused to bypass until every flank was secure, fed into an American narrative that he was cautious to a fault. In the days before Overlord, as armies massed in southern England, Montgomery made a point of visiting American units, addressing troops, reviewing formations. On paper it was a gesture of coalition solidarity, but many U.S. officers read it differently: a performance before the world, a reminder that he was the senior ground commander. Little gestures mattered. A curt word, a tensed smile, a refusal to yield the spotlight, they accumulated in American minds like evidence. Yet to many British officers, he seemed simply confident, perhaps even scrupulous in his planning. The brew of admiration and resentment simmered under the surface. He had, after all, earned renown in North Africa, El Alamein, and Sicily. Then came Normandy, and with it the clash of doctrines. Americans wanted breakthroughs, bold thrusts, aggressive exploitation. Montgomery insisted that the Allied front must advance methodically, shoulder by shoulder, consolidating each foothold before pressing on. When U.S. commanders in France, Patton among them, pushed hard in open terrain, Montgomery resisted requests to commit reserve British units to reinforce fast-moving American spearheads. Those refusals, or delays, were never forgotten in the American Corps and Army staff offices. Stories circulated: Monty wouldn't risk his British divisions, they said, unless the whole plan was safe, measured, controlled. Whether fairly or unfairly, the narrative stuck. By late 1944, wartime events sharpened those resentments. During the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery was given command of the northern shoulder of the Ardennes counterattack, including U.S. Ninth Army under his temporary command. For many Americans, that moment felt like encroachment, a British general given operational authority over American troops in a crisis that was deeply American in its stakes and cost. Some felt their national command was being overridden. Bradley, Hodges, and others raised quiet objections. To them, Monty was not merely a partner but a superior with authority they distrusted. Operations like Market Garden deepened the division. Montgomery's ambitious plan, a sweeping airborne push to cross the Rhine and bypass German defenses, was seen by many U.S. staff as overreach, unbalanced, and logistically fragile. When the operation faltered, the blame was quick to spread. Americans accused him of insufficient planning for supply lines, of ignoring warnings from subordinate officers, and of inflating the chances of success to feed his legend. In U.S. headquarters, Montgomery's name became shorthand for bold gamble with too little margin of error. And personality always counted. Montgomery was outspoken, often rigid, sometimes condescending. He would publicly criticize subordinate commands, including American ones, in press statements or in lectures. He expected deference, and he reveled in reputation. To American generals who believed in mutual respect among equals, this inflexibility grated. Private letters and memos from U.S. officers describe moments when they felt belittled or overridden by Montgomery's directives, even when the tactical situation lay clearly in American hands. Some began to wonder if Monty valued victory or prestige more. Yet to dismiss Montgomery as merely arrogant would miss the complexity. In British circles, he was considered temperate in casualties, cautious to preserve lives, refusing flamboyant gambles that might decimate formations. He believed coalition warfare demanded certainty and that loose ends must be tied. He resented what he saw as American willingness to accept risk and casualties in pursuit of speed. For him, a decisive, sustained victory was better than a flashy advance followed by collapse. Those differences in war culture, risk tolerance, casualty philosophy, doctrinal doctrine, created a fault line. So by the time U.S. troops pushed into Germany's heartland, many American officers harbored a quiet dislike for Montgomery. They didn't loathe him as an enemy, but they saw in him a rival of ego, doctrine, and national pride. In the mess halls of U.S. Corps headquarters, you heard whispers, "Montgomery is always calculating his own reputation." You heard complaint that British forces under his command seemed insulated from American pressures, from losses, from the brutal urgency Americans felt in every push eastward. That sense of disconnect, of different war aims under one alliance, only made the distrust deeper. Montgomery, meanwhile, often seemed oblivious, or unwilling, to navigate that tension. He could be conciliatory in private, but in public he rarely bowed. His memoirs, later, rekindled controversies, as he defended his decisions and cast aspersions on Allied companions. By then, the rift between American and British perceptions of Monty was sealed in granite. In the end, the story of American dislike is not just about one general. It is about the collision of styles, command cultures, national pride, and personality under the strains of World War. Montgomery was, in many ways, a mirror, reflecting American anxieties about British caution, British expectation of respect, and the uneasy balance of coalition power. When he walked into an Allied command center, he brought with him not just strategy, but reputation, ambition, and a burden of expectation that many Americans would carry with bitterness for decades to come. The desert of North Africa was where Montgomery's legend was born, and where the seeds of American resentment began to grow. When he took command of the British Eighth Army in August 1942, morale was at rock bottom. Rommel's Afrika Korps seemed unstoppable, and British soldiers were tired of retreating. Montgomery arrived like a force of nature, brisk, confident, almost theatrical in his certainty. He told his men they would fight only one way, forward, and his speeches electrified the ranks. He reorganized, re-equipped, and re-inspired the army. When the Battle of El Alamein began that October, Montgomery's plan was meticulous and deliberate. And when it ended, the British had achieved their first decisive victory against Nazi Germany. The newspapers hailed him as a savior. Churchill called him a miracle worker. His face appeared on posters. Britain had its hero. But as the headlines celebrated Monty, American commanders watching from nearby headquarters began to grow uneasy. The United States had just entered the war, and its generals, men like Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, and Omar Bradley, were determined to prove that America could fight shoulder to shoulder with the best. They respected Montgomery's discipline but were wary of his arrogance. He spoke in absolutes, dismissed opposing opinions, and carried himself like a man certain that only he understood war. In private meetings, he often lectured American officers as if they were junior cadets. His British subordinates tolerated it. The Americans did not. The first real friction came during Operation Torch in late 1942, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Eisenhower, newly appointed as Supreme Commander, was trying to coordinate British and American forces for the first time, a monumental task filled with cultural clashes. Montgomery, who reported to the British command but worked alongside the Americans, made no secret of his opinion that Ike was too soft and too political. He believed decisions should come from professionals, not diplomats in uniform. He also viewed Patton's aggressive style as reckless, calling him a good showman, but a bad general. Patton, in turn, saw Monty as pompous and slow, a man more interested in caution and credit than victory. When the Americans met Montgomery face to face, they found him prickly and unyielding. He arrived at meetings in his trademark beret and open-neck shirt, giving the impression of informality, but he dominated the room with cutting remarks and condescending smiles. He would lay out his plans in exhaustive detail, referring to "my army" and "my victory," even when American troops were part of the operation. Eisenhower's staff quickly learned that working with Monty meant endless negotiation. He refused to compromise, often rejecting suggestions outright. One American colonel later said that dealing with Montgomery felt like arguing with a wall made of pride. Yet, there was no denying his effectiveness. In Tunisia, Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's 2 Corps closed in on Rommel from opposite directions, driving the Germans and Italians into retreat. The campaign ended with the Axis surrendering over 250,000 troops, an extraordinary success. But when the victory celebrations began, Montgomery's public statements irritated his allies once again. He credited his own army's brilliance, barely mentioning the Americans. His tone was not one of partnership, but superiority. American newspapers picked up on it, and letters home from soldiers reflected the growing divide. "The Brits love Monty," one GI wrote, "but over here, we call him Mr. Big Head." The tension carried into Sicily in 1943. Montgomery insisted on commanding the eastern assault, leaving the western advance to Patton. The two generals' rivalry boiled into open competition. Montgomery moved cautiously, determined to protect his forces and follow his plan. Patton, stung by Monty's attitude, raced across the island in a whirlwind of speed and aggression, liberating Palermo and reaching Messina first. The victory embarrassed Montgomery, who had publicly claimed he would be there ahead of everyone. American correspondents gleefully reported that Patton had beat Monty to the punch, and even Eisenhower could feel the rift widening between his key commanders. To the Americans, Montgomery represented everything they disliked about the old British style: slow, methodical, obsessed with hierarchy and procedure. To Montgomery, the Americans were brash amateurs who relied on luck and brute force instead of disciplined planning. Even so, Montgomery's confidence only grew. He believed his methods had saved Britain in North Africa and would now save Europe. But to the Americans, his insistence on control was suffocating. He often demanded that all plans run through him, even when American divisions were leading the fight. Eisenhower, a diplomat at heart, tried to smooth things over, but the damage was done. Behind closed doors, Patton mocked Montgomery relentlessly, calling him "that cocky little limey," while Bradley complained that Monty treated every operation as if he alone carried the burden of victory. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, these personal tensions became strategic ones. Montgomery was appointed ground commander for the D-Day landings, a decision that made political sense but irritated many in the American command. They respected his experience, but they also knew what came with it: the ego, the demands for credit, the endless arguments about tactics. In Montgomery's view, he was the architect of victory. In theirs, he was the man who always wanted his name written in the history books first. The contrast between British reverence and American resentment became one of the war's defining personality clashes. To the British public, Monty was a national symbol, a calm, unflappable genius. To many Americans who served beside him, he was an infuriating perfectionist whose pride was as unyielding as the desert sun under which he'd first made his name. The war was far from over, but already the lines of admiration and animosity had been drawn. And as the Allies turned their eyes toward Normandy, those divisions would only deepen when Montgomery stepped onto the grandest stage of all. By early 1944, Bernard Montgomery had reached the height of his power, and, ironically, the point where his reputation with the Americans began to unravel. The Allies were preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord, the assault on Nazi-occupied France. At its core was a monumental challenge of coordination: American, British, and Canadian forces, under one command, storming the beaches of Normandy. And sitting at the top of that Allied pyramid was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the calm, diplomatic American tasked with holding together an uneasy coalition of egos, ambitions, and national pride. Among those egos, none loomed larger, or proved more difficult to handle, than Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery had been appointed ground commander for the invasion, a move the Americans accepted with polite reluctance. He was brilliant, no doubt. His North African campaign had given him a reputation for methodical planning and relentless attention to detail. But those same traits came with a tendency toward arrogance. To his British subordinates, he was demanding but inspiring. To his American counterparts, he was overbearing and dismissive, often implying that British leadership was the only thing preventing the war from spiraling into chaos. From the start, Monty made his mark. When he arrived to review the initial invasion plans, he declared them entirely unworkable and promptly rewrote them. His version expanded the landing front, called for more divisions, and reorganized the assault. To many historians, these changes were essential to the operation's eventual success. But to the Americans who had spent months drafting those original plans, his arrival felt like a storm. Montgomery's style grated on nearly everyone around him. In meetings, he lectured rather than discussed, waving his baton for emphasis, and often dismissed American officers as inexperienced or overly impulsive. He had a particularly uneasy relationship with General Omar Bradley, who would command the American ground forces during the invasion. Bradley was quiet, methodical, and respected by his men, but Montgomery saw him as timid and unimaginative. Bradley, in turn, found Monty's superiority unbearable. The tension simmered through the spring of 1944 as the two men were forced to work side by side on one of the most complex military operations ever attempted. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, spent as much time soothing egos as he did studying battle maps. When D-Day finally arrived on June 6, 1944, the invasion succeeded, though not without chaos and sacrifice. The beaches of Normandy were secured, and Montgomery basked in the achievement. For him, it was proof that his vision had been right all along. But almost immediately, the friction between British caution and American aggression began to grow. Montgomery's next task was to break out from the beachheads and push inland toward Caen, a city he had promised to take within days. The battle for Caen, however, dragged on for weeks. German resistance was ferocious, and the terrain, hedgerows, narrow roads, and well-prepared defenses, played to the enemy's advantage. While Monty's forces were bogged down in the north, the Americans, under Bradley and Patton, were preparing for their own breakout further west. The delay around Caen infuriated the Americans. They saw Montgomery's slow advance as another example of his overcautious style, a man obsessed with perfection rather than momentum. From Monty's perspective, he was tying down the bulk of German armor, allowing the Americans to maneuver freely. "My job is to pin the enemy," he later said, "so the Yanks can swing the hammer." Strategically, he was correct. But in the competitive world of Allied command, credit mattered as much as results. To many Americans, Montgomery's explanation sounded like self-justification. The more the U.S. Army pushed forward, the smaller Montgomery's star seemed to shine. Then came Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. Bradley and Patton unleashed a storm of armor and air power that smashed through the German lines and sent the enemy reeling across France. It was exactly the kind of bold, aggressive move Montgomery disdained, and it worked spectacularly. Overnight, the headlines shifted. The Americans were now the heroes of the advance, sweeping toward Paris in a rush of liberated towns and cheering crowds. Montgomery, still methodically grinding forward in the north, looked slow, even irrelevant. He was furious. He complained that the Americans were misrepresenting the overall strategy, that the success of Cobra was only possible because his troops had fixed the German armor in place. In private, he accused Eisenhower of letting the Americans steal the spotlight. In public, he continued to demand that his own plan, a single, concentrated thrust toward Berlin under his command, be adopted as the Allied grand strategy. To Eisenhower and the Americans, this was too much. The war had become a team effort, and Montgomery's insistence that he alone could deliver victory struck many as arrogance bordering on delusion. Still, Eisenhower tolerated him, knowing that despite his ego, Monty was an invaluable commander. He had the loyalty of his men, the respect of the British public, and an unshakable belief in Allied victory. But privately, Ike confided to his aides that dealing with Montgomery was the hardest part of the job. He once joked that Monty would give you the impression he's just won the whole war himself, even if he's only captured a telephone booth. In the ranks, the Americans' dislike hardened. To the average GI, Montgomery was the embodiment of the stiff, pompous British officer who thought he was fighting the war single-handedly. Patton, ever blunt, mocked him openly, calling him an overrated little man. Bradley was more restrained but admitted that working with Monty was like arguing with a saint who thinks God's on his side. Even Eisenhower, patient to a fault, began to lose his temper during the final weeks of the Normandy campaign. Montgomery's victory briefings were notorious for downplaying American contributions while magnifying his own. Every map he presented showed his forces at the center of the action, every success spun as part of his master plan. The Americans, watching this theater of self-promotion, grew increasingly cold. By the time the Allies were preparing to cross the Seine and push toward Germany, the lines were clear. Montgomery's military genius was undeniable, but so was his alienation of his American allies. He could win battles, but he could not win hearts. What had begun as professional tension in North Africa had, by Normandy, hardened into something more personal, resentment. The Americans saw in Montgomery not a partner but a rival who refused to share the credit. And though he would remain a central figure in the Allied command, the distance between him and his American counterparts had become a chasm, one that no amount of victories could bridge. By late 1944, the war in Europe was reaching a fever pitch, and so was the tension between Bernard Montgomery and his American counterparts. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were racing toward Germany. Spirits were high, but beneath the celebration simmered a fierce rivalry that had become almost as consuming as the war itself. Montgomery believed the campaign had reached a crossroads, and he was determined to prove, once and for all, that his strategic vision was the one that would end the conflict swiftly. What followed would become one of the most ambitious, controversial, and ultimately disastrous episodes of his career, Operation Market Garden. Montgomery had been frustrated for months. The Americans, under Patton and Bradley, were advancing rapidly across France, fueled by Eisenhower's policy of a broad front strategy, pushing on all sectors rather than concentrating resources in one decisive blow. To Monty, this was madness. He wanted a single, powerful strike directly into the heart of Germany, across the Rhine and into the Ruhr, the industrial core of the Reich. It would be risky, yes, but decisive. Eisenhower, cautious as always, disagreed. The Allies were already stretched thin on supplies, and he feared putting all their strength into one thrust would leave them vulnerable elsewhere. But Montgomery was persuasive, and in September 1944, he got his chance. Operation Market Garden was his vision, a daring gamble that combined airborne and ground forces in a single lightning strike through the Netherlands. The plan was breathtaking in scope. 3 airborne divisions, the U.S. 82nd and 101st, and Britain's 1st Airborne, would drop behind enemy lines, capturing key bridges leading into Germany. Then, British armoured columns would race up a narrow highway to link up with them, crossing the Rhine and punching straight into the Ruhr. If it worked, the war could be over by Christmas. But as with so many of Montgomery's grand designs, confidence and execution were not always aligned. From the start, the Americans had doubts. Generals Bradley and Patton thought the plan was too ambitious, too dependent on perfect timing. The terrain, narrow roads, canals, and marshland, was a nightmare for tanks. The Germans were believed to be retreating, but intelligence suggested armored divisions were regrouping near Arnhem, the operation's final objective. Montgomery brushed aside the concerns. He was certain that boldness would carry the day, and as he presented the plan to Eisenhower, he exuded his trademark certainty. "I guarantee success," he declared. It was vintage Monty, confident, commanding, and impossible to argue with. On September 17, 1944, the skies over Holland filled with thousands of parachutes as Market Garden began. At first, everything seemed to unfold as planned. The American paratroopers seized their initial objectives with courage and precision, holding bridges under heavy fire. But as the British 1st Airborne dropped near Arnhem, the farthest bridge, the key to the entire plan, things began to unravel. The intelligence warnings had been right. 2 SS Panzer divisions were resting nearby, and within hours, the lightly armed paratroopers found themselves surrounded. Despite desperate resistance, they were cut off, isolated, and pounded into submission. The British ground advance stalled miles short of their position, trapped on the single highway that became a death trap of ambushes and broken vehicles. For 10 days, the fighting raged. American airborne troops held their bridges heroically, but the advance simply couldn't keep pace. In Arnhem, British paratroopers fought until they ran out of ammunition. The radio calls that came back were haunting, out of bullets. God save the King. When the remnants of the division were finally withdrawn across the Rhine, more than 2/3 were dead, wounded, or captured. Operation Market Garden had failed. Montgomery had promised a knockout blow. Instead, it became one of the costliest miscalculations of the war. The Americans were furious. Patton, never one to hide his feelings, mocked the operation as Monty's folly. Bradley called it a 60-mile-long, 1-tank-wide highway to nowhere. Even Eisenhower, who defended his subordinate publicly, was privately livid. He had trusted Montgomery's judgment, and now thousands of lives had been lost in an operation that achieved none of its objectives. Monty, for his part, refused to admit defeat. He called Market Garden 90% successful, arguing that it had secured much of the Netherlands and weakened German defenses. To the Americans, this sounded like delusion. "Monty never loses," one officer quipped. "Even when he does." But beyond the failure itself, Market Garden deepened the cultural rift between the Allies. To the Americans, Montgomery now embodied everything they found infuriating about British leadership: pride without accountability, caution masked as brilliance, and a refusal to share credit or blame. To the British, he remained their national hero, the man who had saved them in North Africa and stood toe-to-toe with the enemy when others faltered. The divide was not just military, it was emotional, personal. Monty's growing hostility toward Eisenhower's broad front strategy only widened the gap. In public, he was polite. In private, he complained that American leadership lacked discipline and vision. Yet even as Market Garden collapsed, Monty's standing at home remained unshaken. British newspapers hailed him as bold and daring, focusing on the courage of the airborne troops rather than the failure of the plan. In America, however, the mood was very different. War correspondents began to paint Montgomery as a man living off past glories, out of touch with the realities of the battlefield. The U.S. public admired British tenacity but increasingly saw their general as a relic of an older war, too slow, too proud, too convinced of his own genius. Still, Montgomery's story was far from over. He remained one of the most powerful figures in the Allied hierarchy, and his command in Northern Europe was crucial to the final drive into Germany. But the damage to his relationship with the Americans was irreparable. He had gambled his reputation on Market Garden and lost, and though he would fight on, the trust between him and his allies would never fully recover. From this point forward, every operation, every meeting, every decision would be shadowed by the question that had begun to define him in the eyes of his American peers: was Bernard Montgomery a brilliant strategist, or a man who believed his own legend too deeply to see the truth? By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end, but the battle for pride and prestige among the Allied commanders was still raging. The German army was collapsing, cities lay in ruins, and the Allies were racing toward Berlin. For Bernard Montgomery, it was supposed to be his moment of triumph, the final validation of his strategy and leadership. Yet as the tanks rolled east and the Nazi regime crumbled, Montgomery found himself increasingly sidelined, his influence slipping away, his reputation among the Americans permanently scarred. What had begun as a partnership forged in necessity had become a rivalry steeped in mistrust. Montgomery's forces, the British 21st Army Group, advanced through northern Germany, pushing across the Rhine in March 1945. His crossing at Wesel was textbook, carefully planned, meticulously executed, and remarkably successful. To his credit, the operation was one of the most efficient of the entire campaign. British and Canadian units swept into the heart of Germany, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. In his eyes, it was proof of his methodical genius, deliberate preparation, overwhelming force, minimal risk. But while Montgomery was perfecting his crossing, American forces under generals like Patton were already racing far ahead, driving deep into central Germany with breathtaking speed. To Monty, this was recklessness. To the Americans, it was initiative. As the two armies converged, tensions reignited. Eisenhower, now commanding an unstoppable Allied juggernaut, had to balance egos as much as battle plans. The Americans wanted to strike directly for Berlin, eager to deliver the final blow. Montgomery lobbied furiously for the honor to go to the British, insisting his northern position made his army the logical choice. But Eisenhower refused. He had already decided to let the Soviets take Berlin, prioritizing the broader strategic picture over prestige. To Montgomery, this was a betrayal of logic and pride. To Eisenhower, it was the only sensible path to end the war quickly without unnecessary Allied casualties. Behind closed doors, Montgomery's frustration boiled over. He complained that Eisenhower lacked military insight, that he was too political, too willing to compromise with the Americans' decentralized command structure. In letters and private conversations, Monty lamented that if he had been given full control, he could have ended the war sooner and cleaner. But his criticisms leaked, as they always did, and the Americans seethed. Patton called him a prima donna, a tired little fart, while Bradley dismissed him as a man fighting yesterday's war. The bitterness was mutual. Monty saw the Americans as brash and undisciplined, they saw him as arrogant and out of touch. Even as the Allies celebrated victory, the rivalry refused to die. In early May 1945, Montgomery accepted the surrender of German forces in northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Photographs of him presiding over the event, erect, expressionless, every inch the British hero, filled newspapers across Britain. But in Washington and Paris, the image carried a different weight. To American generals, it looked like another moment of Monty basking in glory that wasn't solely his. The war had been a collective effort, but Montgomery never hid his belief that his discipline and planning had carried the Allies when others faltered. It was the same confidence that had lifted him to fame at El Alamein, but now, in the aftermath of Europe's liberation, it felt less like confidence and more like conceit. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Montgomery's attitude toward his American allies became the stuff of legend and exasperation. At a press conference shortly after the war, he declared that the British Army had done the lion's share of the fighting in Europe, that the American forces were brave but lacked strategic experience. The remarks caused uproar. Eisenhower, normally diplomatic, was livid. The U.S. press tore into Montgomery, portraying him as an ungrateful prima donna who refused to acknowledge that it was American manpower and resources that had tipped the balance of the war. Patton, as always, was blunter. "I'd rather fight Monty than the Germans." In truth, Montgomery was a man caught between eras. His methods, meticulous planning, rigid control, deliberate pacing, had been perfect for North Africa, where he rebuilt a shattered army into a disciplined, victorious force. But by 1944 and 1945, the nature of war had changed. The Americans embraced speed, improvisation, and flexibility. Their tanks moved fast, their supply chains stretched wide, and their commanders thrived on intuition rather than calculation. Monty could never understand this kind of warfare, it seemed reckless to him. Yet to the Americans, it was the future. His brilliance in structured battles made him a hero in 1942, but his inability to adapt made him a relic by 1945. Still, despite the resentment, even his harshest critics couldn't deny his achievements. His troops adored him, even when others didn't. He had saved the British Army from collapse in Africa, crushed Rommel at El Alamein, and held the line in Normandy when German counterattacks threatened to push the Allies back into the sea. His insistence on discipline and preparation had saved countless lives, even if it slowed the pace. But in the grand theater of Allied victory, that nuance was often lost. What Americans saw was a man who refused to share credit and who publicly questioned their leadership. When the war finally ended, Montgomery stood on parade grounds watching the soldiers he had led for years march past him. They saluted the man who had led them through the hardest years of Britain's fight for survival. He was knighted, showered with honors, and hailed as one of the nation's greatest generals. But across the Atlantic, his name remained a point of contention. To the Americans who had fought beside him, he was brilliant but infuriating, a man whose victories were real, but whose ego cast a shadow over them. The alliance that had won the war together ended not in harmony, but in a quiet frost between two sides that never quite understood each other. For Montgomery, it was a bittersweet triumph. He had won the war he set out to fight, but he had lost the admiration of the Allies who helped him fight it. In his own memoirs, he would later write that his only real mistake was trusting too much in others to see things my way. To the Americans, that summed up the problem perfectly. For them, Monty was not the enemy, but he was never truly a teammate either. And even in victory, he remained, as one U.S. officer once said, the most respected man we never liked. In the end, Bernard Montgomery helped lead the Allies to victory, but in doing so, he waged another battle he could never win, the war for hearts and minds. To his troops, he was a savior. To his American allies, he was a thorn. And long after the guns fell silent, the question lingered, was Monty a genius misunderstood, or a hero undone by his own pride?